I jolted awake to a silence that wasn't right, not the gentle kind with birds chirping, but a heavy, unnatural hush that screamed something was off. My private lake, usually a shimmering jewel under the morning sun, looked like it had been ripped from a nightmare. The water, once crystal clear, now churned a murky, fluorescent green, bubbling with a sickly glow. A chemical stench hit me hard, stinging my eyes as I stumbled to the window, and then I saw them, dozens of fish, belly up, lifeless dots on the surface. My stomach twisted into a knot as the truth sank in. Someone had poisoned my lake. I raced down to the shore, barely processing the scene. The water hissed and fizzed at the edges, the grass yellowing where it touched, a toxic stain spreading like a curse. This wasn't an accident, it was deliberate, and my mind zeroed in on one name: Karen Middleton. Karen was the neighborhood's self-anointed HOA dictator, a platinum-blonde tyrant with a scowl carved into her face and a voice that could strip paint when she got going. She had it out for me ever since she realized my property, lake included, sat beyond her HOA's grasp, a private oasis she couldn't touch with her absurd rules. That drove her up the wall. For months, she'd hounded me to drain it, claiming it lured unwanted wildlife, wrecked the neighborhood's uniformity, even calling it a safety hazard once. Someone might fall in, she'd said with a straight face. I'd laughed her off then, but now, staring at my ruined lake, the humor was gone. She was unhinged enough to do this, and the pit in my gut told me she had. I stormed back inside, heart hammering, needing proof. Luckily, I'd set up security cameras around my property, mostly for the shed, but they'd caught everything. I yanked up the footage from the night before, fast-forwarding through the dark until 2:47 a.m. when there she was. Karen in her pastel pink cardigan and khakis, dragging massive jugs from her SUV. She stumbled under their weight, nearly tripping as she lugged them to the water's edge, then dumped the contents in, one by one, quick, nervous, glancing around like a cartoon villain before wiping her hands, smiling at her handiwork, and strolling back to her car. I rewound it jaw tight, making sure I wasn't imagining things, but it was crystal clear. Karen had poisoned my lake with glee, like she'd done the world a favor. Rage boiled in my chest, mixed with disbelief. Who wakes up and decides to commit a crime over a lake they don't like? Confronting her would be pointless. She'd deny it, play the victim, twist it around. I needed something she couldn't dodge. That's when it clicked: the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA didn't mess around with illegal dumping, and this wasn't some backyard weed killer. Those jugs screamed industrial-grade trouble. I grabbed my phone, found their emergency hotline, and dialed with a smirk. EPA Enforcement Division, what's your emergency? The voice answered. I took a breath. Yeah, hi, my neighbor just committed an environmental crime, caught her on video dumping chemicals in my lake. A pause. Can you clarify, sir? Oh, I've got footage, and it's bad: green water, dead fish, toxic fumes. The agent's typing sped up. We're sending a team, don't touch anything. I hung up, grinning. This was going to bury her. The wait for the EPA felt electric, my pulse thrumming with anticipation as I backed up the security footage in 3 places. Cloud, hard drive, even a copy to my lawyer, just in case Karen tried some legal sleight of hand. I paced the porch, coffee in hand, eyes on the lake's toxic glow. The stench was thicker now, a chemical burn in the air, and the dead fish bobbed like grim confetti, Karen's masterpiece. By noon, the rumble of heavy engines broke the stillness. 2 black SUVs with government plates rolled up my driveway, doors swinging open in sync. 3 agents stepped out, suits crisp, faces hard with purpose, hauling equipment and testing kits. Agent Brooks, a tall guy with sharp eyes and a clipboard, scanned the scene before nodding at me. I leaned against the railing, playing it cool, but inside I was buzzing. This was the reckoning she'd never see coming. I led them to the shore, where the water still bubbled green and menacing, the grass around it shriveling into brittle yellow streaks. Brooks squinted at the mess, his brow creasing as his team got to work. Vials dipped into the lake, pH testers humming, notes scribbled with a precision that made my chest hum. One agent swirled a sample, held it to the light, and frowned. This isn't just herbicide, it's industrial-grade stuff civilians shouldn't even have. My smirk slipped. This was bigger than I'd thought. So what's that mean? I asked, watching Brooks dust off his knees. It means whoever did this didn't just break a local rule, they're in federal violation territory. Could be ecological sabotage. My stomach flipped with glee. Karen was toast, and she didn't even know it yet. Then I caught her across the street, peeking from behind her perfect hedge, coffee mug clutched tight, her face a mask of shock as the agents swarmed my property. I locked eyes with her, raised my mug in a mock toast, and watched the color drain from her cheeks. She knew something was up, but not the half of it. Predictably, she didn't slink away. She stormed over, cardigan flapping, voice shrill. "What's going on here? Why are government agents on private property?" Brooks barely glanced up. "EPA business, ma'am. This is an environmental crime scene." Karen forced a laugh, high and brittle. "Oh, come on, it's just a little weed killer. I was helping. That lake's an eyesore." The agents froze, heads swiveling to her in unison, their calm cracking into disbelief. Brooks flipped his clipboard. "Are you admitting to dumping chemicals here?" Karen's panic flickered before she rallied. "Well, it's not harmful. Everyone wanted it gone. I did a service." Brooks didn't blink. "Ma'am, you violated the Clean Water Act. Contaminating a water source, even private, is a federal offense. These are hazardous substances." Her bravado wobbled. "Hold on." I cut in, grinning. "Don't worry, Karen. I've got you on camera, midnight dumping and all. Send it to my lawyer, too, just in case." Her mouth flapped fish-like. "He's lying. He hates the HOA." Brooks tapped his tablet, pulling up the footage I'd sent. There she was, pouring jugs with villainous flair. Her face went white. This is out of context." Brooks sighed. "Ma'am, you're coming with us for questioning." She shrieked. "You can't do this. I'm HOA president." But he waved a document. "You've got rights, but you're facing fines, maybe charges. Step this way." I sipped my coffee, savoring her meltdown. She'd terrorized us for years, but now the feds had her number. Karen's voice hit a pitch that could have shattered glass as the EPA agents flanked her. "You can't arrest me, it's just water. He's being dramatic, look at him smirking." She jabbed a finger my way, but I just shrugged. "Karma, Karen, remember fining folks for uneven hedges." Brooks, unfazed, motioned her toward the SUV. "Ma'am, we're not debating this, let's go." Her hyperventilating kicked in. "I have rights." But they escorted her off, her cardigan a pink blur of defeat. I let out a long, satisfied breath as the vehicles pulled away, the lake still a toxic mess, but justice now rolling forward. She ruled the neighborhood like a petty tyrant, fines for trash cans, paint swatches rejected. But this wasn't an HOA slap on the wrist. This was federal, and I'd made sure she couldn't wriggle free, footage locked and loaded. The street buzzed alive before their dust settled. Neighbors peeked from porches, blinds twitched, whispers racing like wildfire. Karen Middleton, HOA queen, hauled off by the feds. It was a bomb dropped on our quiet little world, and by evening the emergency HOA meeting was a circus, packed with residents who'd never bothered showing up, shoulder to shoulder, grinning like kids at a prank gone right. The board, suddenly rudderless without her, fidgeted up front. Doug, the jittery vice president, cleared his throat. "We, need to address Ms. Middleton's situation. Given recent events, we should vote on her presidency." A voice shouted, "Throw her out!" And the room exploded in agreement. Doug flailed for control, but the tide had turned. Karen had spent years sowing enemies, and now they reaped her downfall. In 10 minutes a motion passed, a vote sealed it, and she was out. Applause thundered as her power crumbled. I watched from the back, arms crossed, sipping water like it was premium entertainment. Karen hadn't just lost her title, she'd lost her shield. Without the HOA, she was just another homeowner, and after this, no one would bow to her again. 2 days later, the EPA dropped a bombshell statement. The lake's chemicals were hazardous waste. Cleanup would take weeks, fines would bankrupt a small nation, and Karen was personally liable. The HOA wasn't on the hook. Every cent would bleed from her own pockets. Her community service excuse didn't fly against federal law. I was outside when she slunk home, stepping from her car like a woman aged a decade overnight, smugness swapped for exhaustion. She spotted me on my porch, hesitated, then marched to her door with forced dignity. "Welcome back," I called, coffee raised. She glared but stayed silent, humbled maybe, but not broken yet. Over the next week, she turned ghost, once strutting like royalty, now dodging stares, whispers, and outright laughs as her downfall became the neighborhood's favorite gossip. The real kicker came when the EPA cleanup crew rolled in, gear unloaded, hazmat suits prepped, and called her over. She stomped across her lawn, ready to bark them off, but the lead agent handed her a clipboard. "Per your settlement, you're assisting in remediation, supervised, non-negotiable, or it's more legal trouble." I nearly spat my drink. Karen, who'd fined us for blades of grass out of line, now had to clean her own mess. She froze, the weight crashing down, then took the gloves and suit in silence, knees in toxic muck, scooping dead fish under watchful eyes, muttering curses I'd bet were aimed at me. I snapped a few pics, grinning. This wasn't just justice, it was poetry. Karen knee-deep in my lake, gloved hands pulling out slimy, contaminated muck while EPA agents loomed overhead, was a sight I'd frame if I could. Her pastel cardigan swapped for a hazmat suit, her scowl buried under a mask, every scoop a grudging surrender. I leaned on my porch railing, coffee warm, snapping a quick video. Not too intrusive, just enough to immortalize the HOA dictator reduced to a cleanup grunt. Her muttered curses floated over, probably my name in there somewhere, and I couldn't resist. I uploaded it online, titled HOA Karen Finally Cleans Up Her Act. It blew up overnight, comments rolled in. Lake Killer and Dictator down memes sprouted, and strangers who'd never heard of our street piled on. Karen's humiliation went viral, and I savored every pixel of it. She'd terrorized us for years, fines for unshorn lawns, paint color crusades, and now the world laughed at her expense. She tried to spin it, of course. Word got back she was whining to anyone who'd listen, claiming it was blown out of proportion, that she was unfairly targeted. But no one bought it. The EPA didn't haul you off for misunderstandings, and that footage of her midnight dumping wasn't a suggestion. It was a smoking gun. The lake cleanup stretched on. Weeks of hazmat crews and chemical tests, and bit by bit, the water cleared, green murk fatting, fish no longer floating dead, the stench lifting like a bad memory. Karen's wallet bled dry, fines, legal fees, cleanup costs, all hers, no HOA to foot the bill. Her community service excuse had crashed against federal law, and the settlement forced her to toil alongside the crew, a daily reminder she'd picked the wrong fight. I'd caught her dumping on camera, called the feds, and watched her empire crack. Justice didn't get sweeter. The neighborhood, meanwhile, bloomed without her. Tom, the new HOA head, axed her petty rules, and people relaxed. Lawns grew shaggy, porches sported unapproved decor, all without her shrill voice raining down. She'd been a ghost since coming home, dodging the stares and whispers, her strut replaced by a skulk. The viral clip only tightened the noose. Neighbors smirked openly now, her reign a punchline. Then came the clincher. A for sale sign stabbed into her lawn one morning, no fanfare, just a quiet admission she was done. Fines, humiliation, and a neighborhood that loathed her had broken her spine. I watched from my porch as she avoided eye contact, her dignity in tatters, and felt no pity. She'd poisoned my lake, my peace, and I'd turned her weapon back on her. Cameras, EPA, patience while she flailed. A few weeks later, a moving truck growled up. Karen emerged, face hard with defeat, barking at the movers as she packed her life away. Neighbors gathered not to help but to watch, waving her off with grins that screamed good riddance. I stood by the lake, clear and alive again as her car rolled out, no words swapped, no grand showdown, just her taillights fatting down the street. She'd ruled with an iron fist, thought she could bully me into submission, but I'd outplayed her. Footage to the feds, her own rules against her, and a viral nudge to seal it. The sun dipped over the water, clean air filling my lungs, and I smiled. She was gone, the lake was mine, the neighborhood free, and her echo of terror silenced at last. I'd won not with noise, but with proof and time. Karen's taillights vanishing down the street marked the end of an era. My lake sparkled again, the neighborhood unshackled, and I stood by the water's edge, breathing air free of her chemical taint or her tyranny. The for sale sign had been her surrender, the moving truck her retreat, and those neighborly waves as she left weren't farewells. They were celebrations, a collective exhale after years under her thumb. Tom's HOA reign brought calm. No more fines for trivialities, no more paint color edicts. Just people living, yards untamed, and porches proudly cluttered. Karen's ghost lingered only in the viral clip still racking up views. HOA Karen, a meme legend now, her downfall a cautionary tale. I sipped coffee on my porch, the lake's gentle ripple a balm, and felt the wind settle in, not loud, just deep. She'd come for me, and I'd sent her packing. It all started with that eerie silence waking me, the lake gone green, fish dead, a toxic stink that screamed sabotage, and Karen's name flashing in my head like a neon sign. She hated it, my private slice of freedom beyond her HOA clause, nagging me to drain it with wild claims, wildlife uniformity. Someone might fall in, and I'd laughed her off, underestimating her spite. That footage at 2:47 a.m., her dumping jugs with a villain's grin, flipped the script. I'd raced to it, rage and disbelief churning, knowing confrontation was useless. She'd deny, deflect, play martyr. So I'd called the EPA, handed them the video, and watched the feds roll in black SUVs, agents with kits, Brooks calling it ecological sabotage, while Karen peeked, then panicked, her weed killer lie crumbling under their glare. Her shrieks as they hauled her off. "I'm HOA president?" echoed her delusion, but the feds didn't care. The meeting that night stripped her title, neighbors cheering her ouster, and the EPA's verdict, hazardous waste, personal liability, nailed her coffin shut. I'd toasted her from my porch when she slunk back, then watched her turn ghost, dodging laughs and stares until the cleanup crew roped her in. Karen in a hazmat suit, scooping her own poison, muttering curses while I filmed. That clip going viral wasn't spite. It was justice served hot. Her fines for Hedges' days flipped into her own public shamming, and the "for sale" sign was her white flag, the truck her exit under a neighborhood's gleeful eyes. She'd thought me an easy mark, but I'd played it smart. Cameras, feds, a nudge online, and patience while she sank. The lake's recovery was my trophy. Clear water, no more dead fish, a piece she couldn't touch, and the neighborhood's shift was hers. Tom erased her rules, unity grew from her ruin, and I stood apart, just the guy who'd held the line. Karen had misjudged me, thought I'd bend to her bullying, her jugs of spite. But I'd turned her game, proof to the EPA, her own HOA against her, a viral shove to finish it. She'd ruled with fear, a dictator in khakis, but I'd fought quiet, facts over fury, time over tantrums, and won. Her house sat empty, her power a memory, and I stayed, coffee in hand, like mine, unshaken by her war. She picked the fight, banking on my silence, but I'd answered with evidence and waited her out. Now she was gone, the water clean, and her echo of terror just a ripple that faded under the sun. The lake gleamed under the morning sun, a mirror of calm that mocked Karen's chaos, and I stood on the shore, coffee steaming, feeling the neighborhood's newfound ease settle around me like a warm coat. Her empty house loomed across the street, a silent shell where her reign once roared. Tom's HOA scrubbed her rules clean, and folks embraced the freedom, lawns shaggy, porches loud with unapproved flair, no one flinching at her shadow anymore. That viral clip, HOA Karen finally cleans up her act, still circled online, racking up laughs and memes. Her scooping muck in a hazmat suit, a punchline that stuck. She'd been the dictator, fining us for blades of grass, now humbled into a cautionary tale. I didn't gloat, not outwardly, just sipped my drink and let the wind hum through me. She'd aimed to break me, but I'd broken her instead. It kicked off with that wrong silence. No birds, just dread, and the lake's green horror, dead fish floating, a chemical reek that hit like a fist. Karen's fingerprints were all over it, her grudge against my private water a festering sore. She nagged me to drain it, wildlife, eyesore, safety nonsense, and I'd brushed her off, not seeing the venom brewing. That 2:47 a.m. footage caught her red-handed, jugs in tow, dumping with a smirk. I'd watched, fists clenched, knowing she'd lie her way out unless I hit harder. The EPA was my ace, their hotline a lifeline, and when I'd said, "I've got video," the game changed. Those SUVs rolling up, agents swarming, Brooks calling it sabotage. She'd peeked from her hedge, then stormed over. "Just weed killer," collapsing under the weight of her own lie as the tablet played her crime back. Her meltdown, "You can't do this," didn't sway the feds. The HOA meeting axed her that night, cheers drowning Doug's pleas, and the EPA's ruling hazardous waste, her tab, sealed her fate. She'd slunk home, glared from afar, then faded, a ghost until the cleanup crew dragged her in knees in her own poison, cursing me while I filmed, turning her petty empire into a viral joke. The "for sale" sign was her breaking point. Fines, shame, neighbors waving her off, and that truck hauled her out, no fight left, just a hard-faced exit under a grinning sun. She ruled us with spite, thought my lake her battlefield, but I'd flipped it. Cameras to proof, feds to justice, a clip to bury her, patience while she floundered. Now the lake was mine again, the water alive, the air sweet. Her war lost, my peace won, and the neighborhood thrived without her yoke. Tom's quiet fixes undid her knots, unity born from her fall. Karen had pegged me wrong, thought I'd cave to her threats, her toxic jugs, but I'd outlasted her. Footage to the EPA, her HOA turned foe, a viral shove to seal it. She'd wielded power like a club, a khaki-clad tyrant, but I'd fought with calm, evidence over rage, time over noise, and sent her running. Her house stood empty, her echo a whisper, and I stayed, coffee warm, lake clear, unshaken by her storm. She'd banked on my weakness, thought she could poison me out, but I'd answered with steel, proof, feds, a weight that crushed her. The war was hers to start, mine to end, and I'd ended it standing, watching her fade, the waters ripple my quiet victory. The lake's surface caught the evening light, a serene gloss that buried Corinne's mess, and I stood by it, coffee gone cold, watching the neighborhood settle into a peace she'd never have allowed. Untamed yards, porch quirks, no HOA dictator to screech about it. Her house sat dark, a hollow relic of her rule, while Tom's steady hand erased her fines and fuss. That viral clip still hummed online. HOA Corinne, a laughingstock scooping her own poison. Neighbors swapped it like a trophy, her downfall their bond. I didn't crow, just let the quiet winds sink in. The lake mine, the air clean, her rain dust. She'd come at me with venom, thinking I'd buckle, but I'd turned her spite back, and now she was the one gone, waved off by a street she'd terrorized. It started with that silence, too still, too wrong, and the lake's green ruin, fish dead, a stink that clawed my throat. Corinne's grudge was the spark, her hate for my untouchable water a festering wound. She demanded I drain it, wildlife, uniformity. Safety lies I'd laughed off, blind to her brewing madness until that footage at 2:47 a.m. showed her dumping jugs, grinning like she'd won. I'd watched, rage boiling, knowing she'd twisted unless I struck smart. The EPA was my hammer, their hotline my call. I've got video, my opening shot. Those SUVs roared in, agents swarmed, Brooks named it sabotage. She'd stormed over, we'd kill her. Cracking under her own lie as the tablet replayed her crime, her "I'm HOA president" shriek useless against feds who didn't blink. They'd hauled her off, the HOA axed her that night. Cheers burying Doug's stammers, and the EPA's verdict hit. Hazardous waste, her debt, her hands in the muck as clean-up penance while I filmed, turning her reign into a viral punchline. The for sale sign was her collapse, fines, shame, neighbors' grins, and that truck rolled her out, no fight left, just a bitter exit under a sun she couldn't bully. She'd ruled with a scowl, thought my lake her conquest, but I'd flipped it. Cameras to evidence, feds to justice, a clip to finish her, patience while she sank. The lake healed, clear, alive, mine, and the neighborhood shed her weight. Tom undid her knots, unity grew from her rubble, and I stood apart, the guy who'd held fast. Corinne had misread me, banked on me folding to her jugs, her threats, her HOA crown, but I'd outplayed her. Footage to the EPA, her own rules, her noose, a viral nudge to bury her. She'd wielded power like a whip, a cardigan-clad menace, but I'd fought quiet, proof over fury, time over noise, and won. Her house was a shell, her echo a jest, and I stayed, coffee in hand, lake free, unshaken by her war. She thought me weak, a pushover to poison out, but I'd answered with steel, evidence, feds, a weight that broke her. The war was hers to ignite, mine to douse, and I doused it standing, her gone, the water clean, her terror a ripple lost to the breeze. She'd ruled through fear, but I'd won with calm, turning her lake hate into her own trap. Now the street breathed, the lake shone, and I was here, the guy who didn't bend, watching her fade into nothing but a bad memory under a sky she couldn't touch. The lake mirrored the sunset, a glassy piece unbroken by Corinne's poison, and I leaned on my porch rail, coffee cold, watching the neighborhood hum without her. Lawns wild, porches loud, no HOA tyrant to fine it away. Her house stood empty, a tombstone to her rule, while Tom's quiet fixes let us live free. That viral clip, HOA Corinne in hazmat disgrace, still danced online, a meme eternal. Neighbors swapped laughs, her fall a glue that bound us. I didn't strut, just felt the victory settle. The lake mine, the air sweet, her reign a ghost. She'd swung at me, thinking I'd snap, but I'd swung back with proof and time. And now she was gone, waved off by a street she'd lorded over, my water sparkling as her echo died. It all flared with that silence. No chirps, just dread, and the lake's green horror, fish dead, a stench that screamed her spite. Corinne's war on my private shore, untouchable by her HOA, had simmered too long, wildlife, eyesore. Safety jabs I'd shrugged off, blind to her edge until 2:47 a.m. footage caught her dumping, smirking like she'd crowned herself. I'd burned watching, knowing she'd lie unless I hit hard. The EPA was my blade. I've got video my thrust, and those SUVs rolled in, agents swarming, Brooks dubbing it sabotage. She'd stormed up, we'd kill her, folding under her own lie as the tablet played her crime, her "I'm president." Wail useless against feds who marched her off, the HOA axing her amid cheers that night, the EPA's ruling, hazardous, hers to pay, her tombstone. She slogged in the muck, my camera rolling, her empire a viral jest. The for sale sign her surrender, the truck her flight, neighbors grinning as she faded, no fight left, just a bitter blur down the road. The lake healed, clear, alive, mine, and the neighborhood shed her chains. Tom erased her fuss, unity rose from her ash, and I stood by, the guy who'd held the line. Karen had misjudged me, thought I'd wilt under her jugs, her HOA glare, but I'd turned it. Footage to feds, her rules, her rope, a clip to bury her, patience while she drowned. She'd ruled with venom, a khaki queen, but I'd fought calm, evidence over rage, time over noise, and sent her packing, her house a husk, her power a laugh. I stayed, coffee warm, lake free, unshaken by her storm. She'd banked on my collapse, thought poison would bend me, but I'd answered with iron cameras, EPA, a weight that crushed her. The war was hers to spark, mine to snuff, and I'd snuffed it standing, her gone, the water pure, her terror a ripple lost to dusk. No grand clash, no last words, just her taillights fatting, the lake's breath mine again, the street alive without her weight. She, fined us for grass, ruled us with sneers, but I'd won with quiet, proof to justice, a nudge to fame, her downfall my peace. The sun sank, air clean, and I smiled. Karen was a memory, her voice silenced, her lake hate her undoing. I'd outlasted her, turned her spite to my gain, and stood here, the guy who didn't break, watching the water shine, the neighborhood free, justice a taste sweeter than coffee. She picked me, the wrong one, and I'd ended her reign, not with fists, but with facts and a lake that outshone her ruin.